So as we go to our chapter 60 and 61, the final two chapters in this unit, we're actually going to be talking about folk music. We have here in chapter 60, Revueltas, who lived at the turn of the 20th century, born in 1899. He's actually a Mexican national. He lived his entire life in Mexico, but his music is quite classical, but it has a heavy folk music influence from Mexico. He used the mariachi ensemble quite a bit to give homage to Mexican traditional music. And actually, that's the name of this piece, homage to Federico Garcia Lorca. But it actually, he's giving an homage to a writer. But we can hear the mariachi ensemble at work inside this particular piece of music. It also comes out of the tradition of a piece of music called Son, S-O-N, which actually is song, is where that actually comes from. And that's what the name of this particular movement is. So let's take a listen to a little bit of this, and you will immediately hear it's got what's called shifting meters. Here we have, this is actually 1 beat, 2 beats, 3 beats, back to 2 beats, which is really indicative of all types of Latin music from Central America, South America, and then of course Mexico. So we're going to be hearing quite a bit of that. And then you will also hear a lot of trumpet influence, which is coming out of the mariachi, as well as the violin. So let's take a listen. So the polyrhythmic ideas here really lend itself to the mariachi ensemble. There's that Mexican dance theme. So we can definitely see the folk music here. So we can hear there are folk elements, there are mariachi elements, as well as classical elements in his music. And his music is played quite often today. We have a piece called Senza Maya that is probably his most famous work, that is the one that is most often played. One of the other things I want to mention about chapter 60 is actually this picture here in the text of a mural by Diego Rivera. One of the things that he was a Mexican painter, and he had very strong political beliefs and kind of led a very interesting and crazy life. There was a movie that portrayed him, 2002, it was called Frida. A really interesting story. You should check out the movie if you have the opportunity, Frida. But he was also what I think of as like a folk painter. He was very much in touch with the plight of the poor person, which kind of led him into communistic beliefs. So some of his murals, here's another one of his murals. There's an entire website behind us here that is devoted to showing all of his murals. But a number of them were destroyed, especially here in America, because his beliefs were obviously truly different than our American belief system, because he did have strong communistic ideals. But his work is quite interesting, and it's something that you will see often in even say a Mexican restaurant. But you see his works portrayed quite often on the walls all over the place here in California. So his name is Diego Rivera, and he lived around the same time as Revueltas. And finally, in chapter 61, we're going to talk about Bela Bartok, who was what we call a musical anthropologist. He went out and found a lot of Eastern European folk songs, things that were part of his culture, to bring in to his music. This particular slide, before we actually get there, talks about something called neoclassicism, which was a revival of older works that happened during this mid-20th century time. It was really kind of this rejection of romantic ideals, which we, of course, just learned about in Unit 5. And then we're actually moving into this idea of revival of earlier works from like Mozart, Haydn, those early classical works, but not so much with the idea of strict form or with strict tonality. Really, the idea here is revival of absolute music, the craftsmanship of how they worked these pieces at the time, and actually like less expressiveness, and I thought more moving back into the traditional music of the folk people of the time, of the layperson, of you and me, rather than some sort of elevated or lofty ideal. Now, the other interesting thing about Bartok is he did something that we were also doing here in America, and that he took a phonograph and recording devices into the field to actually record people singing and playing this music, so then he would know how to express it in his music. We were doing this with the blues singers of the time in the South. We were taking mobile units down into Mississippi, Louisiana, Alabama to play, to be able to record these jazz singers and these blues singers, of course, that were happening in America at the time. So it's the same sort of idea, but instead it's a Eastern European flair rather than a Southern American flair. Here's actually a nice picture of Bartok recording a folk song from Eastern Europe. Now, the piece we're going to listen to by Bartok is his Concerto for Orchestra. It's in 5 movements. We're going to listen to the 4th movement. But what's interesting, and the book doesn't really talk about, is he actually moved to America to finish his work, and he actually died here in America. And kind of the other interesting thing about Bartok's life is when he got to America, people knew that he was a cataloger of folk music. So they wanted him to go out and catalog some American folk music. And he had a hard time doing this because, of course, he's not familiar with our folk music. He was familiar with the music of his own home country in Hungary, and all over Eastern Europe. Now, if we actually go into interrupted intermezzo, you're going to hear a couple of different folk songs. Let's listen to the very beginning. There's our first one. Notice the shifting meters. We have 5/8 and we have 2/4. If we go on to the B section, we hear a different melody. So a really lovely sweeping theme. A lot of prominence in the melody, which would be more neoclassical. So this is not traditional romantic music from the 19th century. It heralds a little bit more back to the 18th century with the classical style, but bringing in his own nationalistic influences into the music. So this concludes actually our semester. This is the last video for the semester. So I hope that you enjoyed our timeline, our music history timeline. Think about it. We've actually gone from 400 AD and now we're all the way up to the 20th century, and we've learned so much about how music has grown.